Right. Hey, everybody. So I'm Jess Lopez. I work at Salesforce.org as a member of our customer-centric engineering team. And what that means kind of behind the scenes is that I'm basically like tier 4 support. So if you were to create a case and maybe, especially if it was a nonprofit case, and they told you that your case was going to R&D or the developers or the product team, that basically usually means it's coming to my team. So we get all like and we're none of those things, but we're customer-centric engineering. So I love what I do. I'm in debug logs all day, every day. I learn something new like constantly. So I'm super excited to talk about and share tips and tricks. So Bhavana said, can you spend some time going through debug logs, maybe geared towards admins? So I've put together some new slides. I talked about this at Dreamforce a bunch of times. It's a little bit different from those sessions. But if you want to go a little deeper on what I'm going to talk about today, I have linked to those sessions in my deck. So actually, I'm going to, with that note, I'm going to share my screen. And actually, one other thing I just want to say is thank you for having me. I'm super excited to be here today. So yeah. Alrighty. So can you see my screen? Awesome. Okay. So I doubt I will be making any forward-looking statements, but you never know. Just in case, as always, make purchasing decisions based on what's available in the product today. This is now apparently 2 slides long. So, so in the agenda, so we'll talk about what are debug logs, how do we set them up, what's in them, how can we view them. I have a few Dev Console tips and tricks. If you want more, we can talk about them afterwards. I'm sure there will be enough time to talk about more. We'll talk about limits, I have a few examples, and then, as always, resources at the very end to Trailhead, help and training, all that good stuff. So what are debug logs? How do we set them up? So if anybody set up a debug log, they know it kind of looks like this, where it could just be tons and tons of text. Sometimes they're small logs, sometimes they're giant logs. I've had logs that are like hundreds of thousands of lines, depending on what all is happening when you've captured that log. So debug logs are text-only files that, again, contain all the events you chose to capture during the transaction. And when I say transaction, I'm saying like maybe through the user interface, you created a contact, or maybe you had some Apex code, I don't know, that updated opportunities, right? So debug logs get captured for that real-time, sort of what we call synchronous transaction, and then separate debug logs might be created as well for anything that gets kicked off as a result of that. So, so Salesforce has asynchronous transactions as well. These are things that we typically refer to as future methods, or queuables, things that don't run in real time. So sometimes, for example, if you insert a contact, maybe there's address verification services doing stuff on that contact, and maybe that's not running in real time. That stuff might be in a second log. So sometimes when you capture logs, you might have more than one log. That's what I'm trying to say in this case. So in that debug log, you'll find all sorts of information typically about Apex triggers, Apex code, Apex classes that got called as a result of the triggers firing. Declarative automation is definitely in here, so workflow, flow, and process builder. Validation rules, duplicate detection stuff, all sorts of gems are in these debug logs. And then within each row, there's some pretty useful information. So you can see the different types of queries that ran. So SOCL queries, SOSL queries, if you've got any of those running in your org. And then it also shows the total number of records returned for each query. And that can be useful in troubleshooting because sometimes when you're expecting a record to be returned, but you see that 0 rows were returned in a query, that can be an indication that maybe something isn't quite right. And likewise, on the flip side, maybe you're expecting 1 row return and you get, I don't know, 49,999. That could indicate another issue, right? I've kind of seen it all at this point. So queries are generally a good place to kind of look at in debug logs to see if you're seeing expected results. You also see interesting information about DML. So DML is the acronym we use for database manipulation language. These are things like inserts, updates, deletes, etc. And so you'll see typically, say you insert a contact and maybe behind the scene, well, a nonprofit success pack, for example, if you insert a contact, we automatically create an account and sometimes an address record. So you would see entries for each of those inserts in that particular log. And then you would also see how many records. So again, if something doesn't look quite right, look at the DML as well and see, check those lines and just see what was returned. Also useful is you can see time elapsed. So we'll go much more detailed into this in a second, but it will show you the time elapsed from entry to entry in nanoseconds. So this is basically, you have to divide that number by 1 billion to get the actual number of seconds that corresponds to. And this is a little bit weird as well because debug logs, the elapsed time in debug logs is in nanoseconds, but a lot of other things in Salesforce are in milliseconds. So I'm not sure why they decided to just change things around a little bit here. So just remember the 1 billion number if you want to convert to seconds. Anyway, and that can be useful as well if you want to sort of subtract okay, well, this trigger started at this point and this trigger ended at this point in time. You can do some math, some manual math and say, okay, well, this took 10 seconds to run. That's maybe not so good, or, you can go just dive in a little bit there. You can see where you fall within governor limits. So we have all sorts of governor limits in Salesforce, like number of rows returned in queries, number of queries as a whole, number of DML entries, things like that. And so you can see after each sort of code unit where you fall within these limits. And if you're ever getting like a governor limit error in your Salesforce org, this is a good place to check, because if all of a sudden, maybe after a workflow rule ran or a particular trigger ran, like your limits jumped quite a bit, that's probably a culprit or a place to start looking a little bit deeper. And finally, errors, right? So we see errors a lot in Salesforce depending on what's going on. So typically those errors will get captured from the debug log, and usually my first step in troubleshooting something is to find that error within the debug log and try to see what happened right above it, right before, right? Like if it was a bad SOCL query or maybe somebody didn't have permission to do something, you can typically kind of work backwards and see, why that error surfaced. But aren't debug logs only for developers? This is a question that comes up a lot. No, absolutely 100% not. Now, they are absolutely useful for developers. I use them all the time as a developer back in the day. That's how I learned more about debug logs. But these are super useful for admins, developers, architects, everybody, right? It's a lot of text. So it kind of takes getting used to all that text in the debug log at first, but these are definitely useful for all roles. So, if a user in your org comes up to you and says, something's not working quite right, like you can capture a debug log for them and see exactly what's going on when they do this thing that isn't happening quite right. So again, what happens right before an error? Did my flow actually run, or did my workflow rule actually, hit the criteria that caused a field update or not? You can see that within logs. Why does it work in my sandbox but not in production? This is a common one that I see. I swear it's the same. These orgs are the same, but in reality, maybe some feature was enabled in one and not another. And when you compare logs, you can kind of see maybe the order of execution might be a little bit different. And then finally, it happened for this user, but not that one. A lot of times it's more permissions based. So, all right, so the basis for a debug log is a trace flag. So behind the scenes, there's actually an object called trace flag. And when you create a trace flag, it's basically stating your intent to want to capture logs. So each trace flag behind the scenes has a start and end time, a debug level, and also a log type. And a log type, for the most part, is related to like a user. So you can proactively set up a trace flag. If you go to setup debug logs, and by the way, I know I'm doing slides right now, but I'm happy to walk through this in demo format a little bit. So set up debug logs, we click on new trace flag, and you can set them for a specific user, so any user in the org or yourself, You can also set it for the automated process user. So maybe you have like a scheduled flow or something like that that's not necessarily running as a named user in an org. It's running as the automated process user. So you'll want to definitely trace that person, or that user rather, than a named user. And then you can also do it for a platform integrations user as well. I don't know as much about that side of things. You also have options on that page to set up a trace flag for an Apex class or an Apex trigger. And I thought for the longest time that if you did that, it would just set up a debug log and you'd get information about that particular Apex trigger or Apex class. But that's not actually how it works. So what it actually is an override to another trace flag that you'd probably set up for a user. So for example, say I want to trace my actions for the next 5 minutes in an org. And so I set that up and I realized, wow, there's a lot of information in that org or in that debug log. There's a ton of information about Apex, and I don't really care as much about all of these other Apex classes firing. I'm more concerned about getting granular information about one particular Apex class. So what I can do is I can set up a trace flag for myself. We'll see in a minute how we can tweak different logging levels for various categories, but generally speaking, I could say, okay, for all Apex, I want for my user trace to set that value to none. But then I want to set up a second trace for that Apex class where the debug level is something more granular, like a finest level. And so what that would do, again, would override my user trace settings for that particular Apex class. And then, just put that granular information about that Apex class in my log. So again, just doing the trace on an Apex class or trigger alone doesn't auto-enable any logging of any kind. You have to have a user trace as well. This is just an override. You also set up a start date time and an end date time. Now, when you do this, it defaults to the current date time, and the end time defaults to half an hour from now. But you can change these. So if you wanted to trace maybe a batch job that runs at 2 a.m., you could totally do that. And then you set your debug level. So I've sort of mentioned debug levels a minute ago. But debug levels are, well, I'll go into that in another slide, I guess. So debug levels are at a high level. You have different categories and then different logging levels associated with those categories. So more on that in a second. So you can also passively capture logs. If you were to have the Dev Console open and then you went about creating contacts or whatever, it actually automatically captures logs for you in that Dev Console. Those only stick around for 24 hours, so just keep that in mind. But that's another way, just if you didn't feel like going through the setup debug log and you didn't want your logs to last for several days, just open up the Dev Console and it'll capture stuff for you. Okay, so this is what that screen looks like. And so it's funny, I've seen the screen so many times that I've barely ever read all the text here. There's a lot of text up at the top, but if we do read this text, it does tell us, like, for example, about that override thing that I was talking about earlier. So definitely check that out. This debug level down here, by the way, is it's sort of a set of levels. So there's something that comes pre-installed in Salesforce orgs called SFDC Dev Console. And this is like if you were to capture logs to the Dev Console, these are the default logging levels that get captured there. I would say for the majority of things you're troubleshooting, that debug level is perfectly fine. But if you wanted to get more granular, you wanted to maybe turn certain logging levels off, then you'd want to create your own new debug level. So that looks like this. So if you wanted to create our new debug level. So on the left-hand side, you see there are all these categories for a debug log. So database is associated with SOQL queries and DML, things like that. Workflow is the category that captures information about workflow, process builder, and flow. Then we got validation, Apex code, all sorts of other stuff. Next to each category, we've got a level. The levels range from none all the way to finest in some categories. And finest means that more events get captured for that level. So if we look at the workflow category here, for instance, the level is info. These are all of the events tied to the info category. If we wanted to crank that up a little bit. Maybe you want to see more information about the workflow. If we change it to finest, finest, you'll see we have more events, or finer in this case. Some of them go to finer, some of them go to finest. I don't know why. But you'll see here more events got added to that list as a result of changing that. One thing to note about Apex profiling, be very careful if you do have that enabled. If you have that on finest, for instance, and you go to do a deployment, that can definitely slow things down because it's writing like super granular information about your Apex, like variable stuff. Like, yeah, it can be super useful in debugging, especially as a developer, but just be wary. So if things are slow, it could be because you've got that set to finest. All right, so how can we view debug logs? There are a couple of different ways. So we can do it through setup. Let's go to set debug logs again. There's a related list there that shows all of the debug logs from the last 7 days that were proactively set up through that same page. You can also see them through the Dev Console. So it shows you what I call the passively collected one. So again, if you just sort of had that open and it was just automatically collecting logs for you, would show those in there automatically from your session. If you closed it and reopened it, they'd disappear. But you could go up to the debug menu at the very top. And again, I can show this in a demo in a little bit. You can uncheck the option to show my current logs only, and it will bring those back into view. It will also bring into view any other logs from the last 7 days that you had proactively traced. So it'll show logs that aren't associated with you. Like if you traced another user, you can get those as well. You can view the default mode of a log. You can also view a raw log, which sort of is a more of expanded version of the log. You can also download logs from here. You can download them from setup as well. You can download them by right-clicking on the log and choosing download. And finally, last but not least, you can view them through code editors as well. So like VS Code, for instance, this is more of a developer extension, but there is an option to use the Apex replay debugger. That's beyond the scope of what I'm going to talk about today. But there are other extensions like Financial Force has one called the Log Analyzer extension, which is pretty cool. And I think we'll see more and more log analyzers being kind of sent into VS Code from various developers. Or you can just download it and open the raw log in VS Code, like I do a lot of times, because a lot of times I'll look at an Apex class and I'll look at my log file and I'll kind of do a lot of manual chasing back and forth to see what exactly is going on. So lots of ways to view them. Dev Console, though, is really great for viewing them, and I'll show you why in a few slides. So what's in the debug log? First thing is the header. This can be useful, especially if you saved logs and want to reference them later on. The very first thing you see is typically the API version of the first thing that was called. So it's not the API version of Salesforce right now, which is I think like 50 or so, right? You might see a lower number here depending on like if a trigger was created, maybe a year or two ago, that's going to have a much lower number if the API version wasn't updated recently. You'll also see on that next line all of those categories that we talked about a few slides earlier and their logging levels. So for instance, Apex code is set to finest here, Apex profiling is info, etc. So, for me, sometimes I'll get debug logs from our support engineers and maybe it doesn't have everything I think it should. And if I look at the debug levels here, I might see, oh, maybe it's in a lower setting than I might want to capture one in, so I'll probably capture a more granular one. Next line also can be useful as well because it will tell you the user that the trace was for, and it will also tell you a timestamp and time zone as well. All right, and then we kind of get into the more granular stuff. So timestamp and then time elapsed. So that number in parentheses is that nanoseconds number. And then after that is what we call the event identifier, which is going to be different for pretty much every event that's in your log. If you ever see a number in brackets on that side, it typically corresponds to a line of code in an Apex class. Unfortunately, it doesn't tell you the name of the Apex class within the line. You kind of have to back up a little bit to figure that out. But that can be super, super useful if you are looking at code and want to see what corresponds with what line of code. So we'll see a few more examples of this. Again, a few slides of like, what does the DML one look like? What does a SOCL query look like? Another super useful thing in a debug log are limits. So I mentioned this at the beginning of the presentation that you can see where you fall within different governor limits after each what we call a code unit. And a code unit is just, it's a discrete unit of work within your transaction. So like a trigger or a validation rule or a workflow rule, something like that. So what that looks like is this. I know there's a lot of text, but you'll see for your code or your declarative automations that are running, anything in the default section is related to your sort of unmanaged, your own code, and tells you where you fell within number of SOCL queries, number of query rows, DML statements, all of these things. Then for any other managed package that's installed, that's running in this transaction, you would have a section for those because certified managed packages have their own sets of limits, which is pretty cool. So you'll see here like NPSP ran in this org as well, and there were 4 queries that returned 58 rows. And in my unmanaged code, I had 6 queries that returned 6 rows, right? So if you're running into governor limit issues, you can kind of look after each code unit of like, okay, where was I in limits here? And if you're getting close to a limit, it throws all these asterisks next to it and says something like getting close to the limit. And this is after every code unit, and then there's one at the very, very end of the log for the whole transaction. All right, so Dev Console. So anybody can get to the Dev Console. Well, I shouldn't say anybody. You do have to have the permissions to get to the Dev Console. But I typically demo it when I'm showing logs because it's free. It's easy to launch, right? Just click on the cog in the right corner of Salesforce, and it opens up a view that looks like this. And then we have a logs panel down at the very bottom. So again, I mentioned you can right-click on a log in that panel and download it if you prefer to do that. Otherwise, if you double-click it, it opens up in this main window. But it's a lot of text. And I say sometimes when I present about this that sometimes finding that needle in a haystack is just kind of hard with all this text. So the Dev Console has something called perspectives, which are predefined layouts of panels. So this is actually the log-only panel that you're seeing right now. But if we switch that perspective to something like all, which is a pre-shipped one that comes with Salesforce, it slices and dices it up to look like this. It's a little bit more visual. Also, I joke that it's still sometimes a little bit overwhelming at first, but at a high level, I'll dive into what each of these sections is. Top left is what we call our stack tree. So it's like a tree view of like what's going on, what's calling what. It's a nested sort of directory view. And it's what we call a top-down view of what's going on. So beginning to end being probably the most nested in here. The performance tree tab in that section is more of an aggregate view. So if you had maybe one query that ran 10 times in that debug log, it would show just one time in that particular panel, but it would have a count of 10, right? So you could kind of see the aggregate view that way. Execution stack below it is sort of a bottom-up approach. Execution log in that middle is the same as the log-only view from before. But what's cool about this is that a lot of these panels are connected to one another. So if you did select something from like the stack tree, maybe you selected a query, it would actually jump to that query within your execution log. So you could kind of see a little more in detail what's going on before and after that. The source and variable section on the right, I'm not going to go into that too much. That's a good sort of developer, more developer-oriented section, I would say, but you can set things like we call breakpoints or checkpoints. I forget what they're called in the Dev Console. So you can kind of capture values or variables at a specific point in time in your log and get a little bit more information. That's super high level of what's going on there. I don't use it too often, to be honest. but I think a lot of developers probably use that a little bit more. Execution overview, that wider section, really great as well. It defaults to this timeline view, which can be useful sometimes if you see like a long block. It might show that maybe something is taking a long time, depending on what's going on here, depending on what you're trying to troubleshoot. But what I find most useful is a tab called executed units within that section. So that's another sort of aggregated view of what's going on. So in this example that I have up here, there was an error around too many SOCL queries. So the limit around that is 100. And so what I did in this screenshot is I filtered away everything that was not a query. And I can do that through this little section down here. So you just click all those buttons and they go away. I'm left with just queries. And then I can sort by these aggregates. So if I sorted by count here, it's showing that this one query ran 100 times, and that's actually the limit. So that's my problem in this particular debug log. But it's also useful like for looking at DML. You can look at like max rows and things like that. So I just say explore this as you kind of go on your debug log journey to see if it's a useful thing for you. Also useful heap size. If you've ever had to troubleshoot any heap size errors, this can be useful in here too. All right, so limits. We've talked about those cumulative limits, but debug logs also have limits. Right? Our multi-tenant system has limits of all kinds. So every debug log has a maximum size of 20 megabytes. It used to be like 2 megabytes, it used to be 5 megabytes. So 20 is huge now, but we do truncate at a certain point. It is hard to get to that point. I've hit the limit for sure, but hopefully not many of you will. There is some documentation out there on how it decides what to truncate. I can't tell you off the top of my head, but there is a rhyme. There's a rhyme reason to it, I guess. So in terms of log retention, I mentioned before, if you proactively trace a user, those logs last for 7 days. If you just capture them through the Dev Console, those only last for 1 day. If you generate more than 1,000 megabytes of logs, actually, I don't think is it a 1 minute window or a 15-minute window? I'm gonna have to check that. Well, if you have more than 1,000 megabytes of logs, you run into issues. You'll get an email if you were the last person to modify the user trace. And then you might have to delete some of your logs in order to capture new ones. And then finally, you can set a user trace or trace flag for up to 23 hours and 59 minutes. Not that I would necessarily recommend that, because that might be a lot of logs that you probably wouldn't look at, right? So only try to trace a user for the amount of time that you actually need to. All right, so some examples of what you will see in logs. Okay, lots of text, but because it's log samples. So if you ever want to know what's going on with a SOCL query, the SOCL query entries or the events start with SOCL_execute. So there's a begin tag and an end tag. And let me actually just show you kind of what that looks like. So I do have a log here. This is a good size log. But if I open this up, I'm actually looking in the console right now on a Mac. If I search for SOCL here, this is going to filter down to anything that begins or that contains SOCL_ in it. Now actually I parse these out to a better format because VS Code has a theme on it. So you'll see here, there's a query that ran here on opportunity. It ran on line 126 of whatever Apex class fired this. And then 1 row was returned. And this is where I fell within limit usage for that. So I get 50,000 rows per transaction. This was the first one. This log was actually captured with, I think it was, let me go back to my slides. If you set the database category to the finest option, this is kind of a brand new feature as of sometime in the last year. It exposes this other event now called SOCL_execute_explain. So there's this thing in Salesforce called the query plan. So if you ever write a SOCL query, whether it's within Apex or behind the scenes, even actually if you have a report with filters or you have a list view, behind the scenes what happens in Salesforce is it determines the fastest way to return your data to you. And it kind of uses this thing called the query plan. And the query plan tells you the cost of the query. So it's really awesome that they expose this within debug logs because you can see how expensive your query is. So anything with like a relative cost, well, that's a weird example. This was a weird bug I was looking at earlier. Let's look at this one. Anything with a relative cost of more than 1 is typically not the most performant query. So if you're troubleshooting slowness and it's related to maybe a SOCL query, you can kind of look and see what the relative cost of that query was. It tells you how that query was performed. So there are different ways that Salesforce performs the query behind the scenes. So there's a table scan where it kind of like scans all the records in the object. Or if you do a search that's related to indexes of some kind, it'll show you in there, in here, if it's going to use that index instead of a table scan. So don't want to get too in the weeds on that one. But the query plan tool is also something that can be exposed in the Dev Console. You can use the query editor to play around with that as well. But I was excited when they introduced that in logs recently. All right, so that's SOCL queries. Again, super useful sometimes when like things aren't working quite as you expect because maybe, like I said, 0 rows are being returned when you expect more than that, or vice versa. All right, so DML. So DML all starts with DML underscore. So if you want to know what about your inserts, updates, etc., again, DML begin. This is the line it began on in the code. And it tells you the operation that was performed. So OP is operation, insert, update, etc. It'll give you the object that it was associated with. Now this one's a little bit weird. It says S-object, and that's because it's related to the nonprofit success pack. And in this case, we were doing something sort of general around S-objects. But typically you would see like the API name of the actual object that you were doing your DML on here. And then the number of rows that you attempted to do that DML on. And then you'd have, again, a corresponding DML end line. There would obviously be tons of stuff in between these things. Maybe workflow gets kicked off and process builder flow, all sorts of other things. But this is how you sort of determine where something begins and ends in DML. And then code units. So I've mentioned code units a couple of times. So if we look back at this, for instance, if I search for code unit, this is a pretty small one. Hold on one sec. If I look at this one, so there's a code unit started for a Visualforce page in this particular instance. Oh, no trigger ran. Bad log example. I have some other ones we can show you in a second. But essentially for every workflow rule, as I mentioned, process builder, trigger, etc., they start with a code unit started, and then they finish with a code unit finished. And it tells you exactly what it is. So workflow contact started, workflow contact ended. Contact trigger started. This was the context that it ran in, and this is where it ended. Workflow. So if you want to know if your workflow criteria actually fired, so if it met maybe the criteria for a field update, there is an event called WF criteria end. And if it's set to true, it met your criteria. And if there was a field update, you would actually see a WF action event corresponding to that. So that's what I have down below. Anything else here, by the way, that doesn't meet the criteria is false. And these are all the resources. So I don't know if we want to walk through and actually capture one together, and I'm happy to answer any questions about that in real time, or I have not been monitoring the chat at all, so I'm happy to answer any questions that came in that way as well.
I think it would be helpful if we could walk through one.
Cool. All right, let us do that. So this is a Salesforce org I created a few days ago. It has the nonprofit success pack installed in it, just because most of my orgs tend to. And then I added some customization on top of it. So I added a custom object in this case. This contact, I had a custom object called workout. And when you create a workout record and let's do that. We create a workout record. Come on, Salesforce, just give it a name. It's called afternoon workout. I'm gonna say I cycled 10 miles today. When I say this, I have a trigger running that updates a total distance field on my contact. So it's doing it through a trigger. I mean, maybe not the best trigger I've ever written, but it works for now. It's good for demo purposes. But then I have a workflow rule running in the background that looks at this number, and if I reach 100 or more miles, in my case, it's going to check off a box called Century Badge because I've got my Century Badge, 100 miles. Actually, I don't know where that field is on my layout. It could be a weird caching thing. Hopefully it'll show up in a minute. But let's see what happens. Oh, there it is. All right, so let me clear this out. Let's put this back at 31. Okay, so what I want to do is, in this case, I'm going to capture a log of creating a workout and seeing if this updates, seeing if this gets called or not, the workflow that says this. So let's go ahead. I'm going to do this through setup. And I'm going to go ahead and create a new trace flag. So this was the stuff I mentioned earlier where you got automated process, platform integration. User is what I choose 99.9% of the time. And then I can go ahead and choose a user. I only have 2 users in this org. This is scratch org, so it's a little bit weird. But my username in this case is user. So it's going to default to right now, and then it's going to default to end half an hour from now. This is in Pacific time, so ignore that as well. This really is right now. And then debug level. I have to click this, and then I can choose SFDC Dev Console, or I can choose one that I created custom. So I did create one called Finest earlier. Let's go ahead and just create another one so you can see that. Let's call this WIT demo. And so again, for each of these categories, I can go ahead and choose, well, I don't care so much about that one. You know what, I really care about Apex code here. I don't care about NBA. That's Einstein Next Best Action, apparently. You've got Wave in here as well. So anyway, you can pick and choose what you want here and save it, and then you have that as an option when you're setting up trace flags. Now I'm going to go ahead in this case. I'm just going to choose Finest. Why not? And then go ahead and hit save. So any debug logs that I've already captured in the org do show up here. So I captured 3 earlier today related to this. Now I'm going to go ahead now and actually create a workout and see what happens. So we go back to my contact record. Let's call this afternoon. Let's call this evening workout. I should have made this an auto number field, I think. Let's say I ran 5 miles. So I'll save that. And this should be updated. Okay, good. It's updated. It's 36 now. But let's see what actually happened. So if I refresh this, I do have a new log in here. So anything you do through the Salesforce user interface, I shouldn't say anything, but a lot of things says, say /aura. It's like lightning. We did this in lightning mode. Now I can view this from here if I want to, but I wouldn't recommend doing this, especially if it's a long file. Sometimes if you try to find stuff on here, it's just really slow. So you can download it, or what we're going to do is open the Dev Console. So again, if you don't already have the Dev Console open, when you go here, there are no logs here. So that can be a little bit confusing at first. So this debug option up at the very top has this very handy option called Show My Current Logs Only. And if you uncheck that, then we have logs. All right. I have a lot more logs in here because I had this open earlier today, but this is my most recent log. And I can double click it. And I've got this view of my logs. So One thing that I do sometimes, and I talked about filtering in my slides, right? So you can filter in this window, but it's a case sensitive filtering. So again, if I wanted to just see, I don't know, SOCL queries, I can use SOCL underscore, and it would show me all of the events in this case that started with SOCL underscore. So there's a lot running here. Again, NPSP is in this org, so it's just a lot going on. So that's filtering. Code units, as I mentioned. So we've got various triggers running here. So we've got my after insert workout trigger running. There's an NPSP trigger that's running. We see workflow as well. So, okay, what happened when the workflow rule ran on that contact? Well, if we click this and we uncheck filter, it stays on that line, which is really nice. So I stayed on workflow contact. So here are all my workflow events right now, right? So I can see this is the name of my workflow. I called it Sentry Badge. This was the formula that determined whether or not I should do my field update. Workflow criteria end was false. So it did not meet the criteria, right? I needed that total distance to be greater than or equal to 100 and to not be 100 previously. So no field update was done. Let's see what happens if I do, let's put something in, let's say we did a 100-mile bike ride, and see what happens if we do hit that Sentry Badge. So let's do workout here. Let's say Sentry ride. I'm big into biking these days, which is why this demo is all about biking. So 100 miles. So now, okay, total distance 136, Sentry Badge earned, got checked off, awesome. So let's go take a look at that log. So 557 was my latest log. Again, I'm gonna filter down to code units, usually the way I do it. Find my workflow in this case. And we see, oops, I went to the finished instead, sorry. Code unit started, there we go. Unfilter. And we see here, workflow criteria end was true. So now I have a few additional lines than I had previously, right? I have this workflow field update. And by the way, you can see, like, I think if I set this to a more finer option, I would get a little bit more granular detail about values, but we do see here that there was a field update for that particular record. So flows, I don't have any flows in this org. Do I have any flows in any of my other orgs? Maybe, maybe not. But flows are interesting. There's a lot of information about flows and process builders in debug logs, and they typically start with lines like flow underscore interview, flow, like super granular. I didn't include any of those examples in my slide deck just because I don't work with them a ton these days, but I think that there is a help and training article out there on like how to kind of troubleshoot them in debug logs if you need to do that. But otherwise, here's that limit stuff I was talking about earlier. So in this case, I have queries, query rows, etc. So yeah, that's what I prepared today for this talk. Again, I'm super happy to answer any questions. And if you want to see other examples of how I like troubleshoot various things, there are links out to the Dreamforce sessions that I've done before. They're like 20 minutes if you're interested in watching those. So questions?
Oh, wow, thank you.
I learned so much. I have never tried to look for workflow stuff, and that's true and false. I also have never been able to get that Apex class and trigger to work for me.
Yeah.
Because I
That's
said,
why,
like,
yeah.
I don't know what it's showing me. Like, just forget it. You know. Wow.
Yeah, I know. It's it's always misleading because you think, oh, it's gonna trace that class or trigger for you automatically, but no, it's like an override.
Yeah,
But
that's
I've,
so
yeah,
good to know.
I haven't used it very often, but the option is there if you want to use it, I guess. So
Yeah, no, this is so cool. Yeah. Anybody, so I mean, it's very obvious that even if you, I hope everybody gets from this presentation is that you don't have to be scared of the debug log, even though you might see a lot of code stuff in there. You know, it's okay because you can filter them out and you can look at workflows and if you might be interested. And can you imagine like when Jess was showing us, you know, like this is the line where you have 100 like SQL queries. Can you imagine you as an admin going to a developer saying this stuff is blowing up because you have 100 queries? They'll be like, what? That would
yeah,
be, if you ever do that, I want to hear about it because that would be amazing.
I sometimes have to
Film
do,
it.
well, I do that less with our developers, I would say. Every now and then I will say, why did this run so many times? I don't think it should have run so many times, right?
Yeah.
But it's more like with us, so Nonprofit Success Pack is it sort of acts as like a base product and then all sorts of stuff is running on top of it. Like our customers typically have other managed packages, they write their own stuff. So with that, if you look in the debug log and you look at code units, for instance, you'll see sometimes like, oh wow, okay, they have this process builder that's doing in what we call an after update, and that's causing all of these triggers and the automation to fire again, and then that's causing this to run again, and we see like what we call recursion a lot. So you see like queries are running a lot, or but yeah, if you this is great for bringing stuff back to developers and saying this could probably be optimized a little bit. So
So go to your developer and say, have you heard of bulkification?
yeah. For sure.
Yeah. No, this is so cool. I learned so much today too. Yeah. That SOCL explain, I had never seen that before. So is that, you say it was recent?
Yeah, it came out, I feel like it came out maybe it was part of the summer release of Salesforce this past year or winter, I forget exactly, but I saw it and I was like, wait, what is this?
Yeah.
Because I talk about the query plan tool a lot in other demos that I do. And so to see it in the debug log was great because then, customers and partners can more easily see what's going on in their own stuff. And I mentioned if you do want to, I guess before you capture debug logs, if you ever do want to do stuff with SOCL queries and know their cost and things like that, if you go to help and preferences, there's this enable query plan option. You can set that to true, save it, and then if you run the query editor, it exposes a different button here. So if you were to run this is going to be a very simple SOCL query, but instead of hitting execute and seeing the rows returned, you can hit query plan, and it basically tells you the same stuff that's in the log. But it's good I think it's a good practice for developers a lot of times to check how their queries, what their query costs are in here.
Yeah.
And again, see if there's a way to optimize them before they deliver code. So anyway, it's another tip and trick.
No,
but I could talk about this for hours.
I know, this is so cool. Yeah, this is so cool. I'm so glad that we recorded this. I'm going to have to go back because I feel like I'm underutilizing the debug log. I usually have like a lot of debug statement and then I filter them out and try to figure out what's going on with my debug log, but there's so much like being given to you.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. No, super cool. And and we have the recording and you'll share the slides. That would be great.
Yeah, totally. Absolutely.
Yeah. So cool. Yeah. Anybody has any questions? Della, I'm going to call you out because I know you were struggling with some of the debug logs. Did you ever find a solution?
So that one I actually didn't revisit the one that I addressed with you at the time.
Okay.
But I have learned, I had no idea there were all these different pathways, like, different views. So I'm definitely going to explore. I'm actually pulling up like my trailhead so I can start looking through and being able to apply what I just saw.
Yeah.
Just as FYI, this I've linked out to all of these things, but this particular help and training link that I said bookmark on, definitely bookmark it because it does tell you like what all of those categories. What all those categories do. It has like some of the event names in here. It doesn't have all of them, but it'll give you a little bit more information about everything, obviously in more detail than I did today. So I wish there was more stuff like that in Trailhead,
Yeah.
but there's like one unit of a module that has some stuff on debug logs. So that's good though, as a start.
Oh, I had a question. I think it was like your first or second slide where you showed like a monitor with the debug log scrolling.
Yeah.
How did you do that? What did you use for that? I know
I
you
think-
guys at Salesforce have a lot of cool stuff. Because I think Allison was telling me you have all these presentation things that are very cool, but what was that?
I think I did it through, we use Snagit to capture like screenshots, but there's a way to capture video. And I'm pretty sure I just said record and I had it record me scrolling down a very long debug log, and then I just insert it in. Yeah.
That was very cool.
Yeah,
I love
thanks.
that. And it shows, yeah, you put it inside a Mac. It was very cool.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Actually, I do have a question. So Jess, I saw that you used Visual Studio Code. I'm just starting to learn it. As a matter of fact, I have it downloaded. How do I access that, or how do I use that for debug logs? Because I saw you showed that up there.
Yeah, good question. So when you, let's see, let me go back to my Dev Console. So if you were to download a log from here, so you can either open raw log, and what that looks like is this, just like text, and you can copy and paste, or you can actually download it, and that will download a .log file. So let me show you what that looks like. So here's I have a lot of .log files downloaded because what I do all day, but by default, at least on a Mac, it opens in this program called Console, which in some ways is nice because you can easily filter stuff away like I showed earlier.
Yeah.
But I don't love the white text on a black screen here. It's a little bit harder for my eyes for whatever reason. So what I typically do is you can either drag it onto Visual Studio Code, and it'll open, open that way in a window like this.
Yeah.
And if you have like a theme, it'll color code it a little bit, which is nicer for me to look at least. Or you can just do file open and find it and open it that way. So that's, that's typically how I do it. And I mentioned the Apex Replay Debugger tool. I haven't used it too much because I don't do much developing myself these days, but there are ways to kind of get the logs to automatically come into here as well, depending on what you're doing. So
okay. Yeah. Oh, thank you.
Yep.
Thanks.
You're welcome.
Yeah.
I had a question, if you don't mind. And
yeah, of course.
Just also want to say thanks so much for amazing presentation once again. I was also saying that whenever Jess has created a ticket and our engineers are looking at it, it's always, there's no question that there's an issue. So that was great documentation from the debug logs. But yeah, I was actually curious. I don't know if you had any thoughts or recommendations specifically for permissions. I feel like that's one of the common reoccurring, like this user needs a permission and they don't have it, and then getting an error. And I feel like that's the most common reason I go look at debug logs. I don't know if you have any recommendations on better filtering or using debug logs in that way.
It's a good question. And it depends how, let me put it this way. When next time I find one, I will reach out to you, only because I think it depends why it's happening. So I have a case right now where a non-system admin is going to a particular page in MPSP and they're seeing what we call a GAC, which is the internal Salesforce.com error with just a bunch of text and numbers and letters on it. And so what's weird about that is that you don't really see the error super clearly in the logs, but you know that the last thing that ran was a query. Like that was the last thing it really showed properly. So typically in a case like that, I would look at all of the fields that it was trying to retrieve from the query and check to see if the user had access to those. So kind of a manual thing there. But a lot of times I would say it's like, yeah, I feel like we've, at least on the .org side of things, Salesforce.org, we have coded permissions things in different ways. We've also done things where like we literally will go through and do what we call a describe within the code and check to see if somebody has access or not. And if we do that, then it might become clear in the debug log, like, well, what field were we on when it errored out? Or what field were we on when we sort of more elegantly caught the error that they didn't have a permission? So it just, I don't have a great explanation for that. It really, I guess, kind of, if there is an error, you try to look at what happened right before it. And again, if it's a query, you look at all the fields and the object permissions and stuff. But yeah, like I said, since we do work together, I'm more than happy if you have one, if you have an issue or something that you're looking at on the QE side of things, or if anything comes my way, I'm happy to reach out and just show you what I would do. So not a great answer because there are many different ways to do it, I would say.
It's what I'm hearing is it's hard, which
it's a little challenging.
Relate to.
It just depends on what, like, if it's happening because of DML, if it's happening because somebody doesn't have access to an object or a field within a query, different things will, Salesforce handles them in different ways, and our products handle them sometimes in different ways. So typically you would get an error. In the case I have today, there's no great error in the debug log, but again, the last thing that ran was the query. So